today I have one of the Napoleon videos from the series, the first one, Napoleon's first victory, Siege at Toulon, 1793. As I promised, I'm going to go through the entirety of this series, hopefully quickly. So let's get started.
An Epic History TV History March collaboration, supported by our sponsor, Osprey Publishing. In the summer of 1793, the French Revolution was entering its fourth year, and France was on the verge of anarchy. In Paris, political extremists had seized control of the revolution. They guillotined the king, and imposed a reign of terror that dealt summary justice to all suspected enemies of the revolution. Hoping to unify the new republic, France's leaders had declared war on the Habsburg Empire. But the conflict quickly widened, and soon France was facing the combined might of Europe's leading powers, determined to stamp out her dangerous political experiment. Meanwhile, whole regions of France had come out in open revolt, horrified by the new extremism of the revolution. In August, the Republic suffered a further, potentially fatal blow, when the city of Toulon joined the revolt. Toulon was France's largest and most important naval base in the south, home to a third of the entire French navy. But now rebels welcomed their old enemy, the British Royal Navy, into the port, led by Admiral Lord Hood, aboard HMS Victory. It was an extraordinary coup. Without a shot being fired, the Allies had crippled French naval power in the Mediterranean, and gained a vital toehold on the French coast. All French forces in the area were immediately diverted to face this new threat, and lay siege to the rebel port. 19,000 troops in all. But since most French officers had been aristocrats, who were now fleeing the revolution in large numbers, they were seriously short of professional leadership. Their commander, General Jean-François Carteau, was a loyal Republican, but a court painter by trade, with no military training. To make matters worse, one of his few professional officers, his artillery commander, Colonel Martin, had been badly wounded on the approach to Toulon. Antoine Salicetti, a Corsican deputy of the National...
Yeah, just one thing I want to point out, that this is actually, once again, a recurring theme that we see with revolutionaries taking over countries, is that oftentimes the best and brightest for the military are the first ones that get wiped out. This happened, especially in the Soviet Union. This also happens. Under Lenin, a number of them end up leaving, fleeing the country because they were still loyal to the Tsar, or they were at least anti-Bolshevik. And then under Stalin, he ended up purging, most of his top commanders, putting him in a really bad spot for World War II. But this is very common in many revolutions where they actually do manage to take power. A lot of the top military brass, they don't want any part of this. Either they don't agree with the revolutionaries, with the new government. A lot of times they actually are purged in some manner. They're executed or rounded up as being aristocrats or enemies of the state or whatever. But it's very common among revolutionaries for purges like this. And the result is always the same. It's that you end up with these people in charge of the military who have no idea what they're doing. They usually have little to no military experience. They don't really have any command experience. Half the time, they're not even commanders by trade. They are something else, and they are just intelligent people that think they can wing it, and others think they can wing it. People who are not military commanders, they don't realize the difficulty of being a military commander. they usually just think that, studying a few books you can do it, but that's not the case. But yeah, this is a recurring theme. This happens again and again. Every time revolutionaries take over in a country, even the American Civil War, not the Civil War, the American Revolution, a number of military commanders stayed loyal to the British and had a shortage of commanders. Actually, if I do remember, the American Civil War, a number of them split off and went with the Confederacy, namely General Lee, who didn't agree with staying in the Union. He was loyal to Virginia, despite being one of the best military commanders in American history. But it's very, very common anytime there's an uprising or a revolution that takes over that there's a massive divide between the military commanders, and when you have one that is based on class, then usually those commanders that are already in there are the first ones to go, because they are a threat, being military commanders, and they are also the enemy, being whatever class they are, usually upper class. So anyway, let's continue.
National Convention in Paris recommended as his replacement a fellow countryman, a 24-year-old artillery officer who was passing Toulon en route to the front, named Napoleon Bonaparte, or Bonaparte. Bonaparte was a professional soldier, but he'd seen almost no active service. Nevertheless, Salicetti was impressed by his manner, and most of all, his politics. Bonaparte had just written a political pamphlet, a short story about a young artillery officer who berates his fellow diners for their disloyalty to the Republic. General Carteau thought it wise to accept Deputy Salicetti's recommendation. The great port of Toulon was well defended by city walls, and a dozen outlying forts and redoubts. They were held by 2,000 British soldiers and sailors, 6,000 Spanish troops, 6,000 Neapolitans, and 800 Sardinians. Artillery would be the key.
So for a few hundred years, probably longer, the backbone of French strategy was defense, using fortifications, walls, anything of that sort in order to hold the line and either repel your opponent altogether through the use of stationary but superior firepower, wait for reinforcements to show up, or an ally to jump in. Then that was usually the strategy. With Napoleon didn't play defense. He just doesn't. He goes on the attack. That's what he does. So he was an exception to the rule. That's why he's probably so successful, because everyone was sort of expecting a typical French strategy, and that just wasn't what he brought. But after Napoleon, they sort of go back to that. When we see the Franco-Prussian War, when we see the World Wars, the French like to sit behind their lines, whether it's, fortifications, castles, the Maginot Line. They like to sit behind, wait for the opponent to come to them, try to overwhelm them with stationary firepower, and bring in reinforcements to overwhelm the enemy. That is generally their strategy. It has been for quite some time. It's a little interesting that they stuck with that, considering how successful Napoleon was. But and they ended up reverting back to that. But I think a lot of that just had to do with the fact that there was a lot of sort of backlash and reverting back to a pre-Napoleonic state after Napoleon was gone. So I think a big part of that was just this is a Napoleon thing, so we're not going to do it anymore because we don't want to be associated with Napoleon. So they kind of went back to that. And it is a tried and true method. It has worked for them for a long time. Eventually it stops working because defensive strategies become the weaker of the two between offense and defense. Offensive strategies generally work better. Even to this day, offensive strategies are favored. But for a long time, defensive strategies were favored, so that now these French strategies were very, very good actually. It's just that later the French failed to modernize, and which is an issue that the French have over and over again.
Key to overcoming these formidable defences. But when Bonaparte was put in command of the artillery on the 16th of September, he found himself with few cannon, not enough trained gun crews, and a shortage of gunpowder and shot. With relentless energy and determination, Bonaparte transformed the situation, requisitioning unused guns, training infantrymen to work them, setting up a new forge and workshop, and arranging transport from Marseille of 100,000 sandbags for constructing new batteries. Through hard work, he was ultimately able to build his force up to 64 officers and 1,500 men, manning 100 cannon, howitzers and mortars. Within days, Bonaparte had established 2 new forward batteries, with good revolutionary names, La Montagne and Sans-Culottes, which brought Toulon's inner harbour within range, and forced Admiral Hood to move all his ships closer to the port. Bonaparte also came up with a plan, one that would allow the French to bypass most of Toulon's defences, and secure the rapid victory the Republic so desperately needed. Bonaparte argued that if Fort L'Aiguillette could be captured, which looked out across the harbour, he could fill it with heavy guns and shell the British and Spanish fleet at anchor. Admiral Hood would be forced to abandon the port and take with him the Allied soldiers that Toulon relied on for its defence. General Carter.
I just want to point something out that I always find interesting, is that whenever you have a single country, or sometimes a small collection of countries that's sort of led by one big bad country, fighting against a series of countries that are allied together, those countries are always referred to as the Allies, even though that's not what they were called. We always end up calling them that in some manner. With the Napoleonic Wars, they were called the coalitions, but we always referred to them as the Allies. In World War I, they were the Entente, and then we start referring to them as the Allies. Now, in World War II, they just got right to the point and just called them the Allies, but they just call themselves the Allies because I guess maybe they figured out that's what we called anyways. But it's just an interesting point to me that no matter what happens, every time you get a scenario where you get a single country like Napoleonic France or World War I Central Powers, or you get a World War II Nazi Germany, you always get this idea of the Allies. And actually there was even some word of the Allies, the term Allies was thrown around too sometimes during the Cold War against the Soviets, that NATO was referred to as the Allies, especially when we're talking about the United States and Europe. That whole group, whether they were NATO or not, were referred to as the Allies. So it's just interesting whenever you have a sort of like singular bad guy in a way, whoever's fighting them are the Allies. And I don't really know why that's a thing, and I don't know why I'm so amused by that, but I just find it funny because it's just one of those history repeats itself, but that's one of those little things that we just kind of keep doing, and I don't know why.
Toulon saw the merits of Bonaparte's plan, and on the 22nd of September, French forces attacked Montcaire. But to Bonaparte's exasperation, while he'd argued for an attack by 3,000 men, the indecisive Carteau committed only 400. Not only was the attack easily repulsed, but it alerted the Allies to the danger. Within 48 hours they'd reinforced Montcaire with thousands more troops, and built a new fort named Fort Mulgrave, bristling with 20 cannon. The position was now so strong, the French nicknamed it Little Gibraltar. Finally, in mid-November, an experienced professional soldier arrived to take command of French forces, General Dugommier. He saw at once that Bonaparte's plan was the only way to take Toulon, and gave it his full backing. Bonaparte, promoted to major, got to work, overseeing construction of several more batteries in preparation for the decisive assault. One forward battery was so exposed to enemy fire that men refused to be sent there. So Bonaparte renamed it La Batterie des Hommes Sans Peur, the battery of men without fear. And suddenly there was no shortage of volunteers. It was an early display of Napoleon's genius for inspiring his soldiers, one that would serve him well in the years ahead.
Yeah, one of Napoleon's great strengths was psychology. Having been a soldier himself before everything, he sort of understood the psychology of men, and I think the revolution had a lot to do with that. He understood the psychology of armies and psychology of soldiers, and he was able to get people to do what he wanted. I mean, he was obviously a manipulative person. He made his way to becoming an emperor, but he sort of had a manipulative aspect about him. He really understood the mindsets of certain people and could just sort of twist things to his needs. Yeah, psychology was one of his great strengths. I mean, he had many great strengths that made him such a brilliant commander, but psychology was one of them. He understood psychology and understood how people thought and how to get them to do what he wanted to do, which is vital in military command, especially in this particular point where he's not really in command of a whole lot yet. He's not emperor, he's not even a general. But even once he is empowered, that sort of psychology is applied to the country and is what really galvanizes it for war. But that's definitely one of his great strengths, among many, many other things.
On the 30th of November, the Allied Land Forces commander, British General Charles O'Hara, tried to seize back the initiative, leading an assault on the new French batteries facing Fort Malbousquet. At first the attack was successful. The batteries were overrun, the French guns spiked. But a counterattack with much greater numbers, and led in person by General Dugommier and Major Bonaparte, drove back the Allies. General O'Hara himself was shot through the hand and captured. 12 years before, he'd surrendered to George Washington at Yorktown during the American War of Independence. Now he got to surrender to Napoleon Bonaparte.
Well, at least he surrenders to the best. So there's that.
In the early hours of the 18th of December, in howling wind and driving rain, the French launched a major assault on Fort Mulgrave. The wet conditions made muskets useless except as clubs or with bayonets. Bonaparte led the second wave in person. Amid fierce hand-to-hand fighting, his horse was killed under him, and he was bayoneted in the thigh by a British sergeant, a wound that came within inches of ending his life and radically changing the course of history. Finally, the Allied garrison was overwhelmed, and Mulgrave fell to the French. Fort L'Aiguillette and Tour de la Balaquière were soon also in French hands. By the following afternoon, the French had 10 heavy guns in L'Aiguillette, placing the Allied ships within range. Admiral Hood could not expose his valuable ships of the line to such a threat. he had no option but to order an immediate evacuation of the fleet and garrison from Toulon. Small Spanish and British teams raced to destroy all the French ships and naval stores that they couldn't take with them. But amid the chaos of their departure, 18 ships of the line were allowed to fall back into French hands. A badly missed opportunity. Many French citizens of Toulon were desperate to escape aboard the Allied ships, knowing that the Republicans would inflict terrible reprisals on the city. British and Spanish ships took as many as they could, about 14,000 in all, but scores were drowned amid chaotic and desperate scenes. Others were left to face the wrath of the revolution. Republican troops entered the city the next morning, and executions and firing squads began almost immediately. For the next 2 weeks, about 200 were executed every day. Allied propaganda later blamed Bonaparte for the atrocities, but there's no evidence he was directly involved. France's young republic was now fighting back on all fronts, and with the fall of Toulon, the Allies had lost a golden opportunity, a chance to stir up further revolt, deal a lasting blow to French naval power, perhaps even overturn the revolution. But instead, the French Republic had weathered one of its greatest storms, in no small part thanks to the remarkable judgment, energy and courage of one 24-year-old artillery officer, now promoted Brigadier General in recognition of his extraordinary service at Toulon. Napoleon Bonaparte had taken his first step on the path to greatness. And for Europe, 21 years of almost constant war awaited. Our sponsor, Osprey Publishing, has nearly 200 titles on the Napoleonic Wars alone.
Yeah, so one thing Napoleon did that was really the backbone of his success is that he understood the tried and true methods of military strategy, not only from France, but from his enemies. And pretty much every country, he would study them, and he always found new ways to do things. He always found something new to do, or he would find an unconventional way to get the same task done. And this really played a huge role in his success, because as we just see in this video here, the French were going to just simply lay siege to Toulon and force back the Allies that way through a long protracted thing, whereas he came in, saw a weakness that he could exploit to expedite that situation, to force them to retreat faster, and to even inflict a lot of damage onto the Allied fleet before it could even retreat. So that's really something Napoleon does well. We see it again. I have another video. I actually did the second video in the series first because it was Napoleon's infantry tactics, which I felt like that was a little more important to understand. But that and it was much more interesting to me. But yeah, that we see it again. If you look at that video, that what he was doing, as I explained in that one, he's doing things completely differently. He's inventing new strategies, new tactics before anyone else can even respond. And not only inventing them, but he's inventing them and applying them to his army. So they're being trained with these new strategies. When the enemy is trying to adapt to these new ones or take them and use them themselves, their armies are not trained to do it. Their commanders are not trained to do it. So they are just sort of winging it and trying to put something together. And it's not nearly as effective. whereas Napoleon was extremely effective. But overall, this is a great video. I will be doing the rest of the series, absolutely. I know I've got a number of comments saying please do the whole series. I assure you I will be doing the whole series. I'm going to try to get another one of these out this week. I have a lot of things on board that I would like to do, but I think I'm going to do at least one more of these this week. I've also started the Russian one, the Russian series. I started, again, sort of backwards. I started with the Russian Revolution, and sort of the reason why I started with that one is it not only is interesting to me, but I think that there are a lot of similarities between the Russian Revolution and the French Revolution, and even the conflicts that came afterwards, whether it be the solidifying of Republican power in France or the civil war in Russia, in which the Bolsheviks secured their power. I think there's a lot of similarities. So I think definitely check that video out too, just because you'll see what happens there, and you're going to see stuff from this video and from other videos regarding Napoleon. There's some other ones that are not part of the series I want to do that are more on the revolution. You'll see a lot of similarities, and I think that's important because, you know, it's such a cliche that history repeats itself, but it really does. It absolutely does. There are a lot of situations which are very similar, and one of the things that we've often considered is, what if Marxism had been a thing at this time when Napoleon was taking power during the French Revolution? How would it have gone differently, considering that they were revolting against the upper class, they were revolting to remove aristocracy, they were revolting for a lot of the same reasons that the Russians revolted, and they were looking for a lot of the same things that the Bolsheviks were looking for in many ways. So it's just kind of interesting to see a revolution, two revolutions that are very, very similar in nature, but one exists pre-Marxism, one exists post-Marxism, and their outcomes are very different, obviously, but I think that they're both fueled by a lot of the same stuff, so that's very interesting to me. That's why I did that video first, because I feel like that's an important one. If I'm going to be jumping in doing Napoleon, then I want to also just touch on how similar Russia was, because it was very similar. But overall, yeah, I love these videos. These are great. I really love the animations of the map. It sort of reminds me of the Total War games, and there was a Napoleon Total War, but just the little flags and the units going around. Yeah, anyway, I really love those. Makes me want to play some Total War. But yeah, but anyway, so Napoleon, like I said, Napoleon's greatest strengths is that he found new ways to do things that others hadn't. He found new strategies. He had the same goals as what the strategies in place had. He sort of just found new ways to do it. And he had this sort of mind's eye to the battlefield. He could see places that were strategically important. He could see weaknesses in the enemy's formations, in their lines, in their fortifications, whatever it may be. He could just sort of see this. And whereas most commanders can, he just had a sort of almost superhuman perception of it. So he was really able to exploit a lot of enemy's weaknesses very, very easily, even if the enemy didn't even know it was there. So that was one of his strongest points. And like I said, I think psychology plays a big role. We see it here, but we'll see it a lot more probably as these go on, is that the way he's able to stir up people and their dedication and their revolutionary fervor. He's able to stir people up and really get them into his ideals. Again, something that is very similar to the Russian Revolution with Lenin. You find someone who's just very good at psychology and is very charismatic and is very intelligent and is able to put all these things together to get people to do what he wants them to do, whether it is political or on the battlefield or whatever. But yeah, so if you haven't checked out the Russian one, please check that one out. I'm only saying that because there are so many similarities between the French and Russian revolutions that I think it's kind of interesting to watch that, and I will be doing the rest of this series, but I also have a few other Napoleon videos that I would like to do in the near future. I'm going to try to get another one of this series out this week. If I don't, it'll be one of the other Napoleon ones, or French Revolution. Maybe just be French Revolution, but maybe I'll do both. We'll see. I just don't want to focus on one thing all the time, but yeah. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and end the video there. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe. If you have any other videos you'd like me to check out, please put them in the comments section, and I will be sure to check them out, and I will see you next time.